Don't stop buying food preps. We need to keep buying food while it's available. There's plenty of evidence that's still coming out that food shortages are on their way, and we need to prepare as if there is going to be food shortages here very soon. Especially if there's a resurgence or more lockdowns, we're going to see more panic buying, and everything's going to be exposed when it comes to how fragile the supply chain is. So stick around for the rest of the video. I'm going to talk to you about the evidence of the food shortages that have just recently come out, as well as what I do to keep motivated when it comes to preparing for food shortages here in the year 2020. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and today we're going to talk about why you need to keep buying food. You shouldn't stop buying food preps just because you've got a decent amount or because you feel like things are starting to get better when it comes to the stock that's in your local grocery stores. A lot of food shortage evidence has been revealed and is continually coming out, and we might be ignoring it thanks to the fact that we're seeing our shelves restocked and we're feeling like food is easier to come by. But in this video, I'm trying to explain to you that you need to keep buying food and you need to keep preparing for those food shortages because we haven't seen them come full circle yet, okay? So there's some evidence going on around the world about food shortages in different isolated locations that's all applicable to what we're dealing with right now in our area as well. And if you're worried about preparing for SHTF and you need to make sure food is a top priority, then hit the subscribe button down below so that way we can keep talking about the different types of things we need to prepare when it comes to making sure we're well-rounded for SHTF scenarios. Obviously, we like to talk about security and we like to talk about awesome gear and equipment, but at the end of the day, food is still one of the top priorities right below water when it comes to surviving anything that's a long-term SHTF scenario. It's not as fun, it's not as exciting as things like firearms or as things like, survival, wilderness survival, like bushcraft and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, water and food will save your life before most of those things will, because it's really what you're going to need to depend on. So right now, while food's still available, we need to keep buying it. And there's some things going on in the world that are causing concern when it comes to those food shortages that keep basically snowballing further and further down the road while we continue on with this year of 2020. So one of those things that I want to address is that in Alaska, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recently allowed at least members of tribal communities to open deer hunting and moose hunting in that area due to food shortages. Now, the state of Alaska is saying, hey, there's actually not a food shortage, so there's no reason for the federal government to come in and tell us what the people of our state can or can't do when it comes to hunting regulation. However, you need to question the reasoning behind why the feds think that there is a food shortage and think that these people should be allowed to go and hunt and procure their own food, whereas the state does not. Because at the end of the day, the federal government tends to have a bigger picture overview as to what's happening in our country as well as the world. And if they're expecting food shortages and lifting hunting restrictions for certain people in order to make sure they're not affected by them, then we should definitely be looking at that and saying, why are the feds on top of this when as the state itself is not? Something to consider. Another thing that's happening right now is Australia is talking about the food shortages they expect to see coming very soon. And one of the largest supermarket chains in Australia has been raising the alarm saying, look, we're going back to, I believe it was level 4 restrictions in the state of Victoria. And that's a large state in Australia. And they're trying to mitigate the pandemic. And by doing so, they're going to create more panic buying, and they're going to limit the amount of people who can work in the production plants and on the production side of the grocery industry. So they expect more food shortages to happen very soon, and they're already seeing runs on their supermarkets. That being said, that exact example coming from Australia can be applied to anywhere else in the world when it comes to putting stricter restrictions in place because of the pandemic. So if we see more lockdowns or a large resurgence or things spiraling out of control when it comes to this pandemic, we can expect the same exact things to happen here. So if that grocer is that upset about these new restrictions and saying that they are not going to be able to keep up with demand based on the supply they have now, that is something you can expect from any grocer in the entire world if the same situation was to fall into place. And we can definitely see something like that happening soon because we're going into winter time where we're going to have the flu season and everything else compounded around the pandemic that's going to make restrictions in certain areas probably come back. So something to consider, and it's happening in Australia right now. So food shortages over there that we can then learn from and apply over here, okay? And don't forget, I am going to explain to you guys one of the tricks I like to do to myself in order to keep prepping for food, because it is a long grind sometimes, and it is hard to be motivated to go out to the store and buy more food for storing away for years and years at a time, not knowing if you'll ever use it or not knowing if you'll ever need it, but at the same time knowing that peace of mind by having it is going to be a huge reduction in stress for if anything ever comes up. So stick around, so I'll tell you guys about that. But another thing that's happened recently that we all are aware of is the catastrophe that was experienced in Lebanon. And that catastrophe alone has created its own food shortages in that region that is already being affected by a huge economic downfall. And so basically what's happened there is that their major port was destroyed where they received most of their goods in foreign imports. And a lot of that country relies on foreign imports for their food and for everything else related to keeping their people fed and alive. So that port's now destroyed, so they have to port to other places, which means they have to charge more for fuel and for shipping and freight and everything else related to not being able to access that port. And at the same time, when that event occurred, it destroyed 15,000 metric tons of wheat in the process, okay? So that was a huge amount of food that that region was reliant on that now no longer exists. So in this one catastrophe, one event that was a large event and definitely not something that we hope to see anywhere else at any time ever again, that one event has caused a food shortage, which should show us how fragile the system is for one event of that nature to actually hurt the food supply to the point where the government in Lebanon is going to have to supply 50,000 additional rations per month for that area of Lebanon in order to help those residents get through this new food shortage that they're going to be dealing with. And they're already supplying, I think it's 270,000 other rations to families in that area as well. So now they've upped it up to 320,000 rations per month to give those people the sustenance they need just to survive. So one event caused that much of a spike in making sure these people are fed and making sure these people are taken care of. Not to mention, the farmers in the region have been hit hard with the economy, and they can't even afford seeds or fertilizer in order to plant. So their own agricultural industry is in the tank, and this one catastrophe caused a huge ripple effect when it came to making sure the people of that area are fed. So it's another example we can apply to our own living situation out here in the United States to say, look, it takes one catastrophe of that size to disrupt food to the point where the government has to literally step in and provide rations for the people of that area. That is definitely something we need to learn from and something we need to be considering when it comes to why we have to keep buying food and why we have to keep preparing for food shortages, okay? Not everybody can grow a garden. Not everybody has land or space. Not everybody can produce their own food. So if you're one of those people, make sure you're buying it while you can. It is something that's important to have, and there's a lot of other great channels out there that talk about food more regularly than I do, but they have great advice. And if I'll talk about some of them later on, but one of my favorites is Alaska Prepper. So if you guys are interested in another channel that has a little bit more focus on food and preparing for when the shortages arrive, I will put a link to his channel in the pinned comment and the description below so you guys can check it out. Now, there's one last thing that I wanted to talk about when it came to these food shortages before I explain my little trick that I like to do in order to keep myself moving forward in the food storage situation that I have for myself here. But there has been extensive studies done on the food supply chain since the start of the pandemic, because the industry itself is trying to get ahead of what their failures were in the initial brunt of the pandemic and trying to get ahead of how they're going to react if this resurgence occurs or anything else like that. So things to consider that were part of the original panic buying and everything else that people were doing. There was a demand channel shift. And what I mean by that is basically, demand changed from restaurants and eateries and cafeterias and everywhere else that you would usually go out and get food on the fly to being at home. And when people cooked for themselves at home, it made a different style of demand on grocery stores and on convenience stores than it did to the suppliers of restaurant chains and eateries and everyone else. So the demand channel shifted, which was hard for the supply chain to react to quickly enough, because suddenly restaurant businesses weren't buying thousands and thousands of burger buns for their hamburgers, but people at home were buying a bunch of fresh produce and buying a bunch of meat and everything else that they weren't usually hitting so hard in the past. So that's something that the supply chain wasn't able to react to and still hasn't fully figured out how to accommodate if this all happens again. The other thing that happened was that there was, let's see, I have a note here, increased demand across channels, okay? Sometimes I have to make notes because I'll forget exactly what I'm trying to say, but increased demand across channels for certain items that affected shortages everywhere else. And what I mean by that is, for example, yeast, okay? So yeast was an increased demand suddenly because everybody was baking bread and everybody was making baked goods at home and people were at home doing home brews and all kinds of stuff. And suddenly yeast became hard to come by, which affected all the other major manufacturers of food products, beer, wine, and everything else that requires yeast in its ingredients. So it was harder and harder for certain companies to get the yeast they needed to keep producing baked goods, beers, wines, everything else like that. And it caused that shortage because suddenly there was increased demand on a certain amount of supply that didn't really exist to be able to meet that demand. So that is something we can expect to see anytime there's a resurgence or anytime there's another run of panic buying, which I do believe we can expect to see. So get ahead of the panic buying, keep buying food and keep prepping food, keep storing it, keep vacuum sealing it and putting it in Mylar bags and storing it for years so that way you don't have to switch it out constantly and you have food ready to go in case that time ever comes. Now, I try to stay motivated by prepping food and making sure we have enough food for our family. And it's not the easiest thing to do because like I said before, it's not fun necessarily, it's not exciting, you know, but it is something that's very important. So by saying that, what I mean is I actually do this thing that's kind of a ritual of mine that forces me to continually prep for food, and it's something that I would suggest you all do if you're struggling to kind of keep that ball rolling, okay? Now I know a lot of you out there already do pressure canning, a lot of you already do all the tips and tricks that you do when it comes to storing food, but for me, something that helps kind of push me along and make sure I keep doing it is I acquire buckets. These buckets are actually empty, okay? So it's a trick, I know, I'm sorry for it, but what this does for me is I buy more buckets and I have to fill them. It's like an OCD thing for me, okay? And by buying more buckets, it means I need to put more food in them. And then every time I seal a bucket, I know that that's about 3 to 5 days worth of food for my family, okay? So based on the amount of people in my family and based on the fact that the ages are different and the amount of food eaten is gonna be a little bit different depending on how long things last or how long these buckets stick around for, 3 to 5 days is about what each bucket can get me. And that being said, if I have 4 of these right here, right now, and we max it out to 5 days each, we're talking 20 more days of food survival here right now where no one's starving and we're all able to eat and maintain our caloric intake. So what I suggest, which works for me, so I just figured I'd share this with y'all, is buy the buckets before you even get the food. Because for me at least, when I have empty buckets sitting around and there's nothing in them, I have to make sure they get full. Or else what's the point? They're just wasting space and I don't need them in my house, okay? So it helps me a lot, it keeps me motivated, and I have this desire to keep filling these buckets, and then once they're full, I gotta go buy more buckets because otherwise I won't have anything else to fill. That is my advice, it's just something I do, it's something that works for me. Thought I would try to help you out because I think we all know food storage is not that fun. It's not that exciting, but you have to do it and you have to keep on top of it. So do whatever tricks work for you when it comes to making sure you keep storing more food away. And if you have a little hint or something that you do to kind of keep that ball rolling, leave it in the comments below so that way other people can get some ideas too to try to help keep them motivated. Because like I said, it's not the most fun thing to do. So I wanted to address that. I wanted to let everybody here know that this is something I do to try to stay ahead of the curve. I wanted to let everyone know you need to keep buying food preps because they are going to have another run at some point here, and you don't want to be the person in line waiting for those supplies, or you don't want to be people that are in the world right now that have to rely on government rations just because that's all there is available. Don't have to wait on rations. You don't have to starve. You don't have to do any of that as long as you get ahead of it now. So I just wanted to remind you guys, don't stop prepping food. Make sure you're getting more while you can. And if you have any questions about it, leave them in the comments below. But otherwise, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.